Hey everyone, how's it going? Today we're going to be talking about military weapon and unit allocation and production, a very action-packed starting point. What I mean by this is how a country decides what kind of weapons to make, how many of them are made, and how they get used. Imagine that you're playing a strategy game. I used to play Age of Empires 3 a lot, and I still do play it from time to time. And you're building up your force to attack opposing players, or the computer enemy. Each kind of unit you build is going to have its own strengths and weaknesses. Other units that it'll be effective against, other units it'll be weak against, and a different resource cost. In a vacuum, taking geographical factors out of the equation, you probably want a good amount of variety, so you always have units for any given enemy and any given situation. You want a solid mix of your normal ground troops, some heavier equipment, and vehicles of any kind. Just a nice mix. Or if you're like me, when you're playing Age of Empires 3, you build 50 cannons and make the stupidest force possible, because it's a lot more fun that way. But thinking more logically and tactically, a force is never constructed in a vacuum, and factors like geography do play a major role in how that force is constructed. If you're fighting a purely land-based war, then trying to invest more in naval vessels is pointless. If you're fighting a sea-based war, then having a ton of ground troops is also pointless. Simply put, you don't invest in weaponry or units that you really don't have a plan or use for. Taking this line of thought into the Second World War, we can see numerous countries that had to follow this general line, leaving some aspects of their military wholly lacking, in favor of building up other aspects. Take Germany as an example. Aside from U-boats, their navy was really lackluster, wasn't it? They had a few large battleships and an assortment of smaller vessels, but compared to countries like Britain, the United States, Japan, and maybe even Italy, Germany's navy was pretty small. Now, they did have a plan in place to significantly build up their navy through Plan Z, not the Plan Z from the SpongeBob movie where Plankton stole King Neptune's crown and placed the blame on Mr. Krabs, and that somehow let him take over Bikini Bottom because I guess the Krusty Krab was somehow the linchpin that held Bikini Bottom together, but instead it was a plan to completely revamp the German Navy. But it was quickly shelved once the war started, and by and large, Germany's military ambitions in the immediate sense involved them fighting almost exclusively on land, in both Europe and Russia. They would take Poland to the east, take France to the west, try to get Britain to surrender or pull out of the war, and then take on Russia. Basically, aside from maybe crossing over the English Channel, German naval ambitions would largely amount to controlling shipping and choking off resources, which can be done with just some submarines and the like. Then, if they got far enough in their plans, then the Navy could be expanded. Then Plan Z could be resumed. For an almost polar opposite situation, we have Japan. While Japan did have significant ambitions in taking mainland China, and Russia was also a major factor as well, a lot of their military focus involved the Pacific Ocean, and creating the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, out of the many island chains and island nations in the Pacific Ocean. Taking all of this liquid real estate meant that the Japanese Navy had to be built up, and with American and British presence in the area, their navy had to be quite strong. There's a great reason why when Japan had naval superiority early on in the war, they were winning and advancing a great deal. When they lost that naval superiority, that was the effective beginning of the end. Sticking with Japan here, how did this focus on their navy end up impacting their aerial forces? Well, of course, they would need a lot of aircraft for their naval combat vessels, their aircraft carriers, hence the construction of a lot of carrier fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. But what of their more traditional level bombers? Well, our subject for today is one of those level bombers, a bomber that was probably Japan's best heavy bomber, and that's heavy bomber in very large quotation marks, because when compared to other heavy bombers of the era, that almost seems like a joke. This is the Mitsubishi Ki-67 Hiryu, known quite simply by the Allies as Peggy. Now, the words heavy bomber and Japan don't seem to mix all that well, and for good reason. Heavy bombers in World War II are most well associated with strategic bombing campaigns, where these massive bombers with massive payloads would fly in droves over cities and industrial centers and population centers alike, inflicting massive damage and causing chaos. While certainly incredibly powerful, heavy bombers also require a significant amount of resources, a great deal of metal and wood for the plane itself, a significant payload of explosives carried within, and a multitude of high-power engines just to move the thing. And Japan at the time didn't have this amazing surplus of resources and factories. Such a large investment just about necessitated a large and important target. Now, if we look at where Japan would be attacking in the Pacific Ocean, was there truly anywhere that would require the use of heavy bombers? Were there these massive industrial centers in the Solomon Islands, or significant population centers in Papua New Guinea? Well, quite simply no. There would be over in China, but even then, the production capabilities and military abilities of China weren't exactly incredible or anything, so a heavy bomber wouldn't really be necessary. And while a heavy bomber could be used to attack mainland America, Japan planned on knocking out America with Pearl Harbor, thus eliminating the need to build such a bomber. This is all to say that Japan didn't have all that enticing a reason to invest in such massive aircraft. Instead, Japan seemed to adhere more to the whole Schnell bomber concept, making these smaller, lighter, and faster bombers that served much better as these more sudden and precise strike aircraft. Additionally, owing to the focus on naval forces, a lot of Japan's bombers would be serving as anti-ship aircraft, attacking either with torpedo or bomb. So with the Schnell bomber concept in mind, and the desired versatility to be a torpedo bomber, Japan's general outfit of bombers largely focused on decent speed and range, along with a max payload that just about matched the weight of a torpedo. Their most produced bomber in the war, the Mitsubishi G4M attack bomber, only had a maximum bomb load of around 2,200 pounds, just a little more than the weight of a single Type 91 torpedo. Still though, for the G4M, for a twin-engine Japanese bomber that started its design process in 1937, it was actually pretty impressive, and had the two factors that would be important for a Japanese bomber: speed and range. With two 1,500 horsepower engines, the G4M1 model had a top speed of 266 miles an hour, and a maximum range of around 3,700 miles. They would achieve this by giving the plane a very large fuel capacity and basically no armor whatsoever, which meant that they would also catch fire basically if you looked at them wrong. Still, this wasn't exactly a new thing for Japanese aircraft in the war, sacrificing defense for speed, range, and maneuverability. But while bombers like the G4M were pretty fast for when they were made and had excellent range and also handling to boot, the sheer lack of defense, at all really, reduced their overall usefulness, and combat against forces like America that had half-decent fighters at their disposal ended up leading to significant losses. In the short term, this would lead to some improvements in their existing stable. For some of their existing quote-unquote heavy bombers, In the Ki-21 and Ki-49, they attempted to increase the defensive armament, and on the latter model attempted to add some armor and some self-sealing fuel tanks to reduce the chance that they would light up like a Christmas tree. However, such improvements on these planes didn't seem to have all that much of an effect. All the while these more short-term improvements were being made, in the background the Japanese military was working on an all-new heavy bomber that would ideally serve as a significant improvement over their current stable. In late 1940, early 1941, already at this time aware that bombers like the Ki-49 would need to be improved upon in the future, and they were also preparing, just in case, for a land-based war with the Soviets that they thought would happen sometime in the future. The Japanese Army Air Force would issue specifications to Mitsubishi for a new twin-engine bomber design, one with high power and actually solid defense. The specs would call for a plane that would use a pair of powerful radial engines, at minimum the Ha-101 engine, with around 1,500 horsepower, but a stronger engine was certainly welcome. These powerful engines would need to power an armored aircraft that had a crew anywhere from 6 to 10 men, that had a defensive armament of 5 or 6 machine guns, a payload of at least 1,764 pounds, a range radius of 620 miles, so basically the actual range would be double that, accounting for the trip there and back, and it would need a top speed upwards of 340 miles an hour. Keep in mind that that was roughly the top speed of the A6M0 fighter. To these quite ambitious requirements, Mitsubishi and lead designer Kunojo Ozawa would design a slim, long-nosed bomber that looked quite similar to the G4M and Ki-49, which the similarity to the G4M makes perfect sense, since that plane was also made by Mitsubishi. Ozawa elected to go with a far more powerful engine, and instead of the Ha-101, he went with the Ha-104, with 1,900 horsepower apiece. The initial design would call for 5 total machine guns, one 7.7 mil in the nose, one 12.7 mil in the dorsal position, two 7.7 mil in the waist position, one on each side, and one 12.7 mil in the tail. The design was also to be equipped with the armor that the late model Ki-49s had, in armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks. This design would be accepted in early 1941, and 3 prototype models were ordered for testing. However, it wouldn't be until late 1942 that the first prototype was finally completed, almost 2 years later, and on December 27, 1942, the first prototype Ki-67 took to the air. But one quick question first. Why did it take them so long to make this plane? It was actually the added armor. The added armor and self-sealing fuel tanks weren't exactly common for Japanese aircraft, so the addition of these on the design meant that the initial designing and construction took a lot longer than it would have otherwise. Still, if this plane was successful, this could be viewed as a bit of an investment for the Japanese military, and they could have an actual armored, high-performing bomber to match their contemporaries and their enemies. The Ki-67 design, measuring in at 18.7 meters long, 22.5 meters wide, and 7.7 meters tall, was a runt among the other heavy bombers fielded by major powers, compared to Germany's HE-177, America's B-24, and Britain's Lancaster. All of those planes had a wingspan above 31 meters, and a length above 20 meters. Weighing 30,347 pounds gross, the Ki-67 was also significantly lighter than the other 3, the closest 2 in weight being the B-24 and Lancaster, with gross weights of about 55,000 pounds, almost twice the weight. The overall size difference between a, we'll say, normal heavy bomber and a Japanese heavy bomber was absolutely staggering. The significant difference in size meant that there was also a significant difference in max bomb load. And compared to the B-24, which had the lowest max load of the previous three at around 8,000 pounds, the Ki-67 didn't even reach a quarter of that, with a max load of 1,764 pounds. Neither in size, weight, or payload did the Ki-67 match the other heavy bombers. While the Ki-67 across the board was quite small, it more than made up for that in how it flew and controlled. Owing to its smaller size, the Ki-67 was remarkably agile, showing excellent maneuverability and the ability to perform loops and turns with ease. The Ki-67 was a bomber that was just about as maneuverable as any fighter, which is all the more impressive considering that the design also had armor, which added a lot of weight. While its top speed of 334 miles an hour was below the initially requested 340 miles an hour, the excellent maneuverability more than made up for it. In fact, the performance was so solid that the Japanese Navy would take notice, and immediately became interested in this design, and Mitsubishi was ordered in early 1943 to install a mount for a torpedo on 100 of the future production models. Some later prototype models were used to test the torpedo rack for the Navy, and just as the Ki-67 performed exceptionally well in its initial testing, it was exceptional here as well. Testing with the torpedo rack was so good that instead it was decided that after the 160th production model, all subsequent models were to have the torpedo rack as standard, meaning that there would likely be hundreds, if not over 1,000 of these planes outfitted with the torpedo rack. However, the designers and military command weren't satisfied with the Ki-67 being just a level and torpedo bomber, and for almost a year, the Ki-67 would be passed around and tinkered with, to experiment with what they could get it to do. With its performance, Japan could have their version of a Junkers Ju-88 on their hands, a plane that could do basically anything and serve in just about any role. But because of this daydreaming of what the plane could potentially do, Japan failed to actually put the plane into production in the meantime. It wouldn't be until December 1943 that finally enough was enough. The war situation now demanded this plane, and the Ki-67 design, here dubbed the Ki-67-1, was effectively frozen as is, and it was brought into production. In the almost full year of tinkering, the defensive armament of the plane would be improved, and the 7.7mm machine guns in the nose and waist position were replaced with 12.7mm machine guns, and the 12.7mm machine gun in the dorsal position was replaced with a 20mm cannon. Because of the nearly year-long delay in production, it wasn't until October 1944 that the Ki-67 started flying combat missions, initially in small numbers as an anti-ship torpedo aircraft around Formosa, modern-day Taiwan. While an effective and well-performing plane in a vacuum, at this stage of the war, the introduction of the Ki-67 to combat was akin to pouring a thimbleful of water on a raging forest fire. Japan's navy had been so utterly damaged, and then was basically annihilated in the Battle of Leyte Gulf later that month, that just about nothing Japan introduced to the battlefield would have a significant impact at this point. Unless Japan somehow pulled their own atomic bomb out of nowhere, they were basically screwed, and subsequent battles in 1944 and 45 were just delaying the inevitable. The overall key aspect of Japan's military strength in the Navy had been eliminated, and the Ki-67 could not do anything to change that. Still though, this didn't prevent Japan from still trying, and the Ki-67 would see some slight improvements and some planned future major improvements. One small change to the major production model that actually saw the light of day was an addition of a second 12.7mm machine gun to the tail, giving it a twin tail turret, and the designation Ki-67-1B. Other than that, though, a lot of the improvements to the Ki-67 were only done in testing and on the drawing board. These prospective improvements involved the addition of stronger engines, improved weaponry, improved bomb load, but effectively though, the Ki-67 line ended with the 1B model, and because of a combination of Allied attacks disrupting production and an earthquake in December 1944 damaging and destroying factories, a grand total of about 700 Ki-67s were made overall. From the baseline Ki-67-1B model, 2 other production planes would be created, and both of them were basically just heavily modified Ki-67s. There was the Ki-109 that was to serve as a heavy fighter and bomber interceptor. Gone would be the bulk of the defensive armament aside from a single tailgun, and all of the bomb capacity was removed as well, and in its place would be a single 75mm cannon in the nose, with 15 shells, intended to just obliterate overhead B-29 bombers. Only about 20 of these Ki-109s were ever made, and the impact they had was almost non-existent. The other significant model was the Ki-67-1 Kai, which, like the Ki-109, removed just about all of the defensive armament and bomb load, and in its place, upwards of 6,393 pounds of explosives were installed in the body, and the Kai was to be a kamikaze aircraft. Only a handful of these were made, under 10, and like the Ki-109, its impact was just about non-existent. So overall, the story of the Ki-67 is really about Japan just getting overzealous. The performance of the Ki-67 was excellent. It arguably was their best performing bomber in the entire war, at least from a specification standpoint. And for basically no reason whatsoever, they delayed production for about a year, at a time when their military was towards the start of a major downturn that they would never recover from. Now, if Japan hadn't delayed the project for a year, and instead they started seeing combat in October 1943, would all that much have changed? Probably not. But it certainly wouldn't have hurt to have a solid plane like the Ki-67 around. The Ki-67 overall serves as a lesson to just sort of take what's available to you when you're in a rough spot. Just don't try and get too cute with it. Or, I guess for Japan specifically, don't try to get too kawaii with it. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So, thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. As I'm writing this script and reading it right now, I basically have 1.5 eyes, maybe 1 3/4 eyes out of 2 to work with, as my left eye is kinda swollen. It kinda looks like I got punched in the face. The cause of this wasn't a bug bite or allergies, as that has happened before, or even a punch to the face, but instead a singular little pimple under my eyebrow. It's like my skin hates me. Remember to take care of your skin, because it will hurt you if you don't. But anyway, I'm gonna go suffer some more, so I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.